Hi, this is the first lesson on homeostasis. We're going to start off with the definition. The definition of homeostasis is the body's ability to maintain relatively stable internal conditions, even though the outside world changes continuously. So your cells are all working together in order to maintain this stable internal environment, even though when you're walking outside, things are changing, temperature, pressure, and you're constantly consuming food, which changes the ion composition of your body, changes the glucose levels. So what your body is doing is working together to maintain a stable internal condition. So there are changes in your homeostasis. You won't always be at set point, but your body will do what it needs to get it back to that optimal body function. So some terms that you'll need to know before we start with the components is that your body has set points. Every single organ system has set points in which it needs to maintain in order to maintain that optimal body function. An example would be your temperature remaining at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So the set point for temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. This diagram shows you that your set point for your blood glucose level, so if we took your blood right now, what we'd be looking for as a set point would be 90 degrees or 90 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. So that's another example of a set point. So now we're talking about stimulus. So your stimulus is going to be the change in variable. So you walk outside and it's 100 degrees. Now that would be a change in that set point, right? This variable here. So the stimulus is the actual change itself. In this diagram here, we have two different examples. So you have the example of the rise, so you eat, which is going to cause your blood glucose levels to rise. When your blood glucose levels rise, you've changed the set point, right? So that's your stimulus. This is your stimulus. The other example would be your blood glucose levels drop below the set point. So not eating breakfast would be an example, like your blood sugar levels drop significantly. So this would also be a change in the variable. So this is another example of a stimulus. Okay, so there are three different components needed to maintain homeostasis. The first one we're going to talk about is the receptor. So there's been a change, right? So there's been a change in your homeostasis. You're not at your set point anymore. And so there are, in every organ system, you have something called receptors. And when we're talking about receptors, we're now kind of in that whole nervous system area. So the receptor is the type of sensor that monitors the environment and responds to change. Each organ has receptors sensitive to particular kinds of stimulus. So I use the example of skin here. So you have the integumentary system. And you see all the different receptors. So the receptor we're going to talk mostly about today is going to be the free nerve endings, which respond to pain, heat, and cold. Because with the set point, for an example I gave you, was 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit as the set point for temperature. That receptor is for temperature, so that's going to be free nerve endings. So when you walked outside and the temperature was above 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, these receptor cells, right, you can see these nerves are going to sense that change. And now it's going to send a signal to the second component. So component one is your receptor. Component two is your control center. So the receptor will then send a signal to the control center. The control center not only determines the set point, so remember the set point for temperature was 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So it determines the set point, or a particular value a variable should be. It analyzes the input it receives from the receptor and determines the appropriate response. We are talking about the hypothalamus here. So the receptor in the skin sends the signal to the control center. The control center is what identified the 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. It analyzes and it receives that receptor response, and now it's going to come up with that decision. What's the appropriate response? In this case, the appropriate response is going to be to bring the temperature back down to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. As a lot of us know, there's a couple ways to do that. the main way to do it is to sweat. So there's going to be a signal sent to the sudoriferous glands, which are your sweat glands, and you're going to sweat. So now that your control center has decided on the appropriate response, it's going to send a signal to the effector organ. Your effector organ is what's going to actually produce the response, and in this instance it would be your sudoriferous glands, which are your sweat glands, in your skin. So your effector will receive signals from the control center and cause a response that alters the condition of internal environment. So this is like your worker. This is what's actually going to get the work done that the control center has sent that information to you. So here is a diagram to kind of explain homeostasis all together. We split it up, we're going to put it all together. So here is your variable in homeostasis. We're going to stick with temperature, which would be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is your homeostatic set point. You have a stimulus which produces a change, which makes your imbalance. So you have a change in temperature. Okay, so we'll keep the high temperature. So temperature is above 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Your receptor cells in your skin will sense that detected change, and then it's going to send a signal to the control center, which is your hypothalamus. The hypothalamus created that set point of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it will make the decision to bring it back down to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, send the signal to the effector organ, which in this instance would be your sudoriferous glands. It will activate the sweat glands, and you will sweat and decrease the temperature back to 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and that imbalance is no longer, and now you're back to the set point. You have two different types of mechanisms when we're dealing with homeostasis. The first one we're going to talk about is negative feedback mechanism, because it's the most, most of your examples would be negative feedback mechanism. Your negative feedback mechanism, a deviation from the original effect of the stimulus or reduction of intensity. This mechanism causes a change in the opposite direction. So this would be anytime your body is going through that change and it brings it back to the set point. So instead of making it further from the set point, which there's a couple of examples of that, it's going to take that deviation and bring it back. So let me kind of show you an example here. So we're at the set point. Deviation away from the set point, right? So increase in temperature, 98.6 is here, an increase in body temperature, so you're deviating away, and then what happens? You go back to the set point. Negative feedback mechanism. But one thing that students have made, the mistake they made in the past, is they think that negative means you have to go down. That's not the case. You just have to go back to the set point. So another example would be, you're at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going down in temperature. So you go visit up in the mountains, and it's a little colder there. So your 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit internal stable condition starts to decrease. You don't have a jacket, right? So it starts to decrease, and what does your body do? It brings it back to the set point. Okay, that's a negative feedback mechanism because you went back to the 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So negative feedback mechanism is anytime when you're deviating away from your set point, your body causes it to go backwards, goes back. So here's an example. You're going to read this example here. You're going to identify the stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and the type of feedback. So now I'm going to review the answer now that you already put it in. So your stimulus in this case is going to be, remember, your stimulus is the change. What's the change? Your change is in temperature. You went from 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit up to 101 degrees Fahrenheit. So the change in temperature. The receptor is what senses the change. Okay, it's monitoring and it senses when the change occurs. That's going to be temperature sensitive cells. You've actually seen that in the diagram previous. Your control center is what's going to receive the signal from the receptor and make the decision, and in that case this was the hypothalamus. Your effector is your sudoriferous glands because it is the actual organ that's going to do the cooling by sweating. The type of feedback, negative feedback mechanism, because we haven't even gone over positive. Here's another example. Okay, so you have your normal blood pressure here, right? You have some stress. Your stress, it would be your stimulus. Okay, so you have the deviation from the norm. it causes your blood pressure to increase above the normal. The sense receptors detect the change and cause the decreased heart rate and increased blood vessel diameter. So the blood pressure decreases towards the norm and it returns back to normal. So this is another example of negative feedback mechanism. Blood pressure increases, it goes back to the set point. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is positive feedback mechanism. Positive feedback mechanisms, the change enhances the original stimulus and proceeds in the same direction as the initial change. This causes variable to deviate further and further from value change or range. So positive feedback mechanism, your set point, it would keep it increasing. With temperature, a really good example of this would be a fever. So when you have a fever, your body is going to keep increasing past the set point. You actually take medicine usually to break your fever because your body's trying to kill and scramble the enzymes of the bacteria. So it's going to keep increasing. So whatever your set point is, before we talked about it, brought it back, that's negative. Positive is going to keep it going in the opposite direction. Another example is labor. So during labor, you have an increase in hormonal and emotional and physical stress. So what you're going to do is you're going to read this example and you're going to tell me the stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and also throw in there the type of feedback mechanism. It's positive, it's underneath positive, but I'll go over the answer in a minute. Okay, so your stimulus is the change. So what's your change here is going to be the pressure on the cervix. So the baby is putting a lot of pressure on that cervix. The receptors are the sensitive cells on the outside of the cervix. And I like this example because you can see how every single organ has receptor cells. Your control center is the hypothalamus, and your effector is going to be the contraction itself. So the effector is going to be the cells that are inside of the uterus causing the contracting. And this is positive feedback mechanism. Another example, so I'll let you guys put this in. So stop the bleeding. So a break or tear, so you cut yourself, occurs in the blood vessel wall. The platelets adhere to site and release chemicals. The released chemicals attract more platelets. The platelet plug will form. Stimulus is the break. Receptors are the platelets. Effector are the platelets. So it's kind of funny in this one that they kind of like, there's like a chemical between them. There's no control center. There's no signal to the hypothalamus. They kind of, it's all chemically released right there. Type of feedback mechanism is positive because the set point is going further away. So the number of platelets keeps increasing. And just like the example before that, with the labor, contractions keep happening, more and more pressure on the cervix, until the baby is born, and then it stops.